Hi, Deacon Ed McCormick here. This is part 3 of our series on the true meaning of Christmas. And today I'm going to focus on Matthew's infancy narrative. Now, to give you an overview of the story Matthew tells, he begins the gospel with a family tree of Jesus, a genealogy that begins with Abraham and it moves all the way through the history of Israel to Jesus. And then after that genealogy, he describes the birth of Jesus. And the scene is in Bethlehem, and the focus is on Joseph. Joseph is engaged to Mary. He finds out she's pregnant. And in a dream, the angel of God tells Joseph that he should marry Mary. He's going to have a son. His name will be Jesus, and he will be Emmanuel, God with us. And then after Jesus' birth, the scene shifts to Jerusalem, where these magi have come from the east to Jerusalem to Herod's castle. Herod is the king, and they've been following this star, and they want to see the newborn king of the Jews, so they go to see Herod. They then leave there and go to Bethlehem because they find out that's where the new king will be born. They go and offer Jesus gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and then leave by another route rather than go seeing Herod. And in a dream, Joseph is told to flee to Egypt so that he and Jesus and Mary are not there when Herod kills the newborns in Bethlehem. And then after Herod dies, Joseph receives another dream where he's told to return to Israel, but he goes north to Nazareth where Jesus is raised. So that's the story that Joseph tells. It's very different from Luke's story, as we'll see in a couple of days. Now, right now, I want to focus on two features of Matthew's story. The first is that family tree. Preachers are afraid to proclaim it and read it because it's a long list of difficult names, and they're terrified to preach on it. But it is loaded with insights into who Jesus is. Just a couple of things to note about this family tree. First of all, it starts out and it says the beginning or the origins of Jesus. And there's this kind of echo of Genesis. In the beginning, this is the new beginning, the new creation. And the genealogy focuses on a couple of key people: Abraham, David, the exile, and then it ends with Joseph, Mary, and Jesus as the Christ. Now, a couple of things I want to highlight here. This genealogy, this family tree, in effect tells the history of Israel in a few verses. Starting with Abraham, you get the promises that God makes to Abraham, that he will have a son, that he will be a blessing to all of humanity. And remember, God creates humanity in order to be an extension of God's presence in the world, and human beings fail at this. And so God raises up Abraham and Israel to try again, to turn humanity back to her fundamental vocation. And this is the promise God makes through Abraham. And then with David, David is the king, the anointed king. And his son Solomon comes after him. And then after David and Solomon, you get a series of kings that are more and more corrupt until eventually Israel is taken into exile. The Babylonians surround the city of Jerusalem, and they destroy the capital and the temple and deport everybody except for the poor. And so the story, including the story of the exile in the family tree, reminds us that Israel failed to live up to the covenant, and that their story is waiting for a return from exile, waiting for a climax and a fulfillment. And so by having Jesus at the end of this family tree, Matthew is saying that Jesus is the fulfillment and climax of Israel's story. It's saying who Jesus is. Imagine if in your family tree you could say, I'm related to George Washington, Lincoln, FDR, and JFK. That really would say something about who you are in American history. Well, by connecting Jesus' family tree to Abraham, King David, the exile, the promises God made both to Abraham and through the prophets during the exile, and then calling Jesus the King, the anointed Messiah. Matthew is saying that all the promises God made to Israel are being fulfilled in and through Jesus. He is the King, the anointed King of the world. Now, this idea that Jesus is the King of Israel, and the King of Israel will be the King and Lord of the whole world, gets emphasized in other places in Matthew's Gospel, and we'll see more of that in the next video. But I want to turn now to Joseph and his dream. Two things happen in this dream. He is told that he should marry Mary, and that his son's name will be Jesus, and he will save them from their sins. This idea now that Jesus is not just the Messiah, but the one who will save Israel from their sins. And by sins, he doesn't simply mean a list of laws they've broken. No, this goes back to the exile. Sin here refers to our temptation to fall into idolatry, to worship all kinds of things other than the living God. Sin is that which enslaves us, which sends us into exile. And so Jesus here is presented as the liberator, as the one who will free us from whatever debilitates us and enslaves us. And here's the second thing that Joseph is told in that dream. He is told that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. In this passage, Matthew is quoting from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. And he's telling us now, who is Jesus? He is the Messiah, the King of the universe. He is the one who will liberate us from our sins, from all the forces that are dehumanizing and destructive. And he will ultimately be God with us. And this means that God, the God who called Abraham, the God who called David, the God who promised to free Israel from exile, is now personally present with us in Jesus. I'll see you in the next video.